Have you ever experienced total darkness? Maybe it was some moment when you were a small child and you remember waking up in the middle of the night and just feeling like you were surrounded by the dark. Or maybe it was sometime when you were visiting a cave somewhere and maybe there were lights lining the cave, but you got down very far down inside the cave and then they shut the lights out and it was complete and total pitch black darkness. I think it's actually a little bit difficult for us in our day to experience the absence of light altogether. We have so much light that surrounds us these days, but I think we all know what it's like to feel the thick darkness, to feel a darkness that almost seems as if it's crowding us in or coming in around us. And I don't think that's a new experience for humanity in our day and age. In fact, I think one of the key themes throughout the book of Isaiah is this very idea of darkness and light. All throughout the book, we see Isaiah playing off of these two ideas to talk about the darkness that the people experience in the midst of their sin, and yet the light, the hope that God comes to bring to them. One of the most significant meditations on the theme of darkness and light happens in the book of Isaiah in chapters 8 and 9. And so, in Isaiah 8 and 9, we find Isaiah reflecting on the current state of the people. There, they are sort of pursuing whatever they want. They're going after their own desires, and it's having disastrous consequences. So let's pick it up here in Isaiah chapter 8. We'll start in verse 19. It says this: "When they say to you," that's what the people who surround you, "when they say to you, inquire of the mediums and the necromancers who chirp and mutter. Should not a people inquire of their God? Should they inquire of the dead on behalf of the living?" So the idea is when people encourage you to pursue dark magic, to consult those who make some predictions about the future, the mediums and the necromancers, the people who have this illicit connection with the spiritual world and who love to wax eloquently about what might come next. When they encourage you, you just remember, people should inquire of their God, not of them, right? Should we consult the dead for the sake of the living? Of course not. So verse 20, to the teaching and to the testimony. These are the reliable places to hear from the word of the Lord, not these mediums and necromancers, right? Yet we live in a world, just like Isaiah did, where people love to turn to anything except to Yahweh himself. And so verse 20 says, if they will not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. You hear the imagery. They're without light. And without light, it's just hard to see what you're doing. So, verse 21, they will pass through the land, greatly distressed and hungry. And when they're hungry, they will be enraged. They'll speak contemptuously against their king and their God, and they turn their face upward. And they will look to the earth, but behold, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. So what's going on here is everyone is sort of pursuing their own way. They're sort of pursuing their own darkness. They're looking up and they're looking down. They're cursing God. They're cursing the king. And they're hardened. They're hurting. They're lost. They're angry. They're hungry. And we realize the darkness for them becomes something that's not just physical. It's not just that they're walking around and they just need to turn the lights on. Sometimes darkness can be emotional or spiritual, and it can overwhelm us. And I think all of us know what it's like to feel a darkness like that. Maybe your darkness has come from the death of a loved one. Someone you couldn't imagine living without is suddenly torn from your life, and you've got to figure out how to pick up the pieces. Maybe it comes from a lost relationship. Maybe it comes from being let go, that job that you had held on to with so much of your heart and soul, and then all of a sudden it's no longer there. Maybe it's from being isolated from others. Maybe it's from some other grief or heartbreak that really does feel like death. But I think for all of us, we can relate to this here. We know what it feels like to experience thick darkness. We've all felt the darkness closing in at some point, and it can be overwhelming, which of course then makes Isaiah chapter 9, verse 1 even more powerful. You see, it's in the midst of the darkness, in the midst of the people groping around and trying to find their way, that we hear this word: there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. These two tribes of Israel were located up north in the land. And when the Assyrians came down and began to destroy the land of Israel, when they started to cart away people from the land and take them away into exile, Zebulun and Naphtali were the two tribes that were hit first. They're the first tribes that experience being taken away into exile. And just like they were the first to experience the exile, now they are the first to experience the dawning of the light, the good news. And so it says that the people who walked in darkness, verse 1, the latter time he made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. So those who were walking in darkness have now begun to have this glorious way dawning upon them. And as he goes on in verse 2, the people who walked in darkness, they have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them light has shone. The word used here for deep darkness is the same word used in Psalm 23 for the valley of the shadow of death. It's a thick darkness, almost tangible, but this is the reality for the people who have now experienced God's light. They didn't do anything to earn it. They didn't do anything to deserve it, but God's light has suddenly come upon them and it has shone upon them. And now God's purposes are being accomplished right there in their midst. Verse 3 goes on, you have multiplied the nation, it says. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. It's like harvest time. I mean, here just a few minutes ago, we were talking about darkness and sickness and sadness and hunger and anger. And now it's like harvest time. We're celebrating, right? They are celebrating God's abundant provision that he has brought to them. And so verse 4, for the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. You see, God has freed the people from their captivity. But the burden that's described here is described in very Exodus-like terminology. Many of the words that reference what happened here were used back in the book of Exodus to talk about how God delivered his people from captivity. Even later in the verse, when it says, in the day of Midian, this is talking about probably the day when Gideon fought this battle against the Midianites, and he achieved liberation specifically for Zebulun and Naphtali, right? He sent messengers to them, asking for volunteers for the army. And so, what's happening here is as Isaiah is trying to paint a picture of what's going to happen in the future, of the hope for the people of God, he does it by using stories in the past that talked about how God had delivered his people previously. In other words, the prophets seem to have a rich history of painting pictures of future deliverance using the colors of past victory, right? Isaiah himself is reading the future acts of God that he's about to step into history and do. He's describing it all as a second Exodus, as a deliverance just like Egypt, just like Midian. So perhaps it's not all that surprising that when the New Testament gospel writers pick up their pens and they want to start writing about the good news of Jesus, they use very Exodus-like terminology as well. Verse 5 goes on, for every boot of the trampling warrior in battle tumult, every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. And so now God is putting an end to all of the means of war. It's actually a little bit like Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, where it says that they will beat their swords into plowshares. God's putting a final end, not just to war itself, but even to the means by which war is conducted. And so we arrive at verse 6. For to us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder. And then we hear about his name. Alec Matier notes about this verse, the emphasis falls not on what the child will do when grown up, but on the mere fact of his birth. And I think that's worth noting. We celebrate not simply because of what the child will do, but because of his birth itself. It's his birth that brings hope and brings joy and brings light to the people. Interestingly enough, even though Handel has made this quite a popular song and one that we often recite around Christmas time, this verse is only quoted twice within the New Testament. But this does not diminish the reality that this verse had an immense impact on Jewish messianic thought as you move towards the New Testament. And so this child is described as one who is royal. He has government. He sits on David's throne, it seems, and he has a kingdom. He's never called king here explicitly, but that does not mean that there are no hints in the text that point in that direction. And so the child bears several names. Now, in the context, it seems to me that these names actually point to God. They talk about who God is. For example, just like the name Joshua does not simply suggest that Joshua is somehow divine, but rather his name, Yehoshua, the Lord, is salvation. His name actually points to the reality of who God is and what God does. In the same way, I think this child's series of names all point to the character of God himself. And so he is called Wonderful Counselor, or perhaps Wonder Counselor. He is a wonder in and of himself, and he gives wise advice and guidance, unlike so many who have given terrible, terrible advice in the nation of Israel. He is also called Mighty God, or perhaps Warrior God, right? Here he's the hero God, the fighter, and when he straps on his sword, watch out. It's also his name that he is the everlasting Father, or perhaps we could say lasting time Father. And I think the idea here is there's not some sort of temporary fatherhood under God's rule, but it extends to forever. And we believe, of course, that God's adoption of us now continues forward into the future. And finally, he's called the Prince of Peace, or Peace Prince. He's so concerned about his people that his concern about their welfare all seems to be wrapped up in his very name itself. He's the crown prince of Shalom. And with the introduction of that word, shalom, or peace, you have the whole history of Israel, I think, crashing back on top of you, reminding you of God's continued provision and care for his people in history. So who is this individual? Well, I think hearing all of these names, we realize that this child points to an incredibly great God, and we may begin to wonder, who exactly is this? Who is this child who points to the greatness of God so fully, so completely? He seems to be rather spectacular in and of himself. And then verse 7, it says, of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness. From this time forth and forevermore, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Instead of the people's sinfulness, like in Isaiah chapter 5, this ruler will rule with correction and not carnage, with uprightness instead of the uproar. And when all of this happens, it's a sign that God is actually moving within the nation of Israel. It's the good news, but I think in its immediate context, we're actually talking about a restoration of the people from exile. They're returning from the exile, from being driven away from the land. And all of this reality is coming because of this new Davidic king who comes to the throne. He accomplishes exactly what God wants. So to summarize, Isaiah chapter 8 talks about how the people walk in darkness. And they don't do it just because it's nighttime, right? They do it because they've chosen the darkness for themselves. This darkness is a self-made, a self-imposed darkness. They can't find the light. They don't even necessarily want it, and they're stuck. They're trapped in this vicious cycle of darkness and sadness and hunger and anger. And we begin to feel just how depressed their situation really is. But then, right in the midst of their misery, God steps in And God brings light. He brings them salvation from the burden that they are carrying around with them. And this light is associated with this ruler, this coming Davidic king who ushers in this era of justice and righteousness for all of God's people. In essence, this is what happens in history when God chooses to bring his light. And so John testifies about Jesus. John chapter 1, the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. Or Matthew, as he's describing the early days of Jesus' ministry, he says that he was baptized by John the Baptist. Then he went out into the wilderness. And then, verse 12, when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. Those sound familiar. So that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Those dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. Those dwelling in the region shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. You see, the gospel writers wanted to draw on this very section of Isaiah in order to help us understand a crucial point. The darkness of our world is coming to an end. The pain, the chaos, the pitch black reality of our world around us, it has been put on notice. God's light is dawning on the world, not because they deserved it, not because they suddenly figured things out and determined how, with some motivation, they might pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and bring the light. No, they were lost. They continued to be lost, and God chose on his own initiative to bring them light. It's his doing. And all of us are the recipients of this glorious gift. According to the gospel writers, with the coming of Jesus came God's light for sinners, for you, for me, and for the very ends of the earth. Light. That's the message of the gospel.